Welcome to AP Euro for Winners.
Today, we are starting Unit 3 with the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution.
Before we get into the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, let's get some context down about some names that are going to come up, especially during the English Civil War. A little bit of background. Let's remember King Henry VIII. That was our new monarch. He was the one who took over the Catholic Church, made it the Anglican Church in England, ruled from 1509 to 1547. Then his daughter eventually comes into power, Elizabeth I. She was a very practical leader, kept England on the come up, managed to deal with the Catholic versus Protestant issues that were in England. And then into our story, we get James I, which was Elizabeth I's cousin, rules from 1603 to 1625. And he's not going to be the main character, but he's the dad of the main character in the story today. And he's going to have a lot of trouble getting money from Parliament to fight various wars. And he's still going to be struggling with that Catholic versus Protestant and Puritan divide in England. Now, Charles I, our next person, our last person on this list, is the main character of the English Civil War. He rules from 1625 to 1649. He is James I's son. And basically, for right now, what we got to know is that he hates Parliament. He wants to have all the power to himself, does not want to share any power with Parliament. And let's talk a little bit about Parliament because we got to understand England's government a little bit. So the idea of a parliament goes all the way back to before AP Euro to this document called Magna Carta in 1217, where basically the English people convinced the king to give up some of the power. It puts checks on the king's power, and the English monarch could not rule absolutely. He's required to share power with the English Parliament, which is a legislative body that represents the English people. And the English Parliament is broken up into two houses: the House of the Lords, which are the super rich nobles, and the House of the Commons, which are the middle class gentry. And gentry is a word we're going to use today to describe the rising middle class in England. So that's a little bit of context about these people.
We're going to go over three main causes of this war. So let's start with cause number one, which is the divine right of kings. Right? This is going to be the tension that's created between the traditions of Parliament and King Charles I's claim to divine right authority. So Charles, thanks to his dad, James, as mentioned in the previous slide, believed that a monarch has a divine right to authority and is responsible only to God. Right? His dad is quoted by saying, "There are no privileges and immunities which can stand against a divinely appointed king," which really sums up their belief, right? As they believed, just as God had granted spiritual authority to the church, also granted political authority to the king to pretty much do whatever he wanted to do. And to challenge the king and to challenge the church at this time, right, was basically to challenge God himself. God is never wrong, so the king is also never wrong. This is the belief of Charles and James coming into their monarchy. This viewpoint directly countered the English traditions that a person's property can't be taken away without due process of law. So Charles is going around taking people's land. He saw these constraints as intolerable. He believed he could seize any land he wanted. Anyone who said otherwise was a threat to his divine right privileges, but Parliament, like we said, had a constitutional process in place for actually seizing land, and Charles just didn't care about that constitutional process. So we've got a lot of tension created from those two things.
The next cause to go into is some religious divides. So there are tensions between the Puritans and the lingering Catholic practices that show itself as conflict. And so if you remember going back, right, when Henry VIII takes over the Catholic Church and becomes the Anglican Church, that's that Protestant feeling that's coming in from Henry VIII. Henry VIII is still pretty much Catholic, he's just without the Pope. So this Protestantism is still very, very Catholic with a different name. But there's this growing dissatisfaction with the Church of England because we have this new group. Remember, the Calvinists in England are called the Puritans. And the Puritans believe that the Protestant Reformation and Henry VIII are not going far enough. And the Puritans want to purify all the Anglican Church and they want to remove all Catholic elements. So King James I, which is Charles the Dad, his response to this is no bishop, no king, which basically means there's no desire for further purification as his power comes from the bishop. So King James I does not want to do anything about this. And King Charles I, King James's son, furthers this divide because he marries a Catholic princess. So now we have someone who's supposedly he's the head of the English church and he's supposedly Protestant, marrying a Catholic princess and supports policies of this guy named the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, who was openly persecuting Puritans. So we see the king becoming more on the side of the Catholics, and the Puritans, who are a lot of what make up the House of Commons, these middle class people, are getting very upset about this. So this is another cause of the English Civil War.
And the last one that we're going to go over is the 30 Years' War. This should sound familiar, that concept. This is going to further increase the tension between Parliament and the monarchy because during the 30 Years' War, England spends a lot of money and gets into a lot of debt because they try helping. Charles I and his dad, James I, spent a lot of money, the money that wasn't actually approved by Parliament, right? So again, insert more tension there. Charles I didn't actually call Parliament into session, pretty much dissolving Parliament when you don't call it into session, for a long time, between 1629 and 1640. That time frame is also nicknamed Charles's personal rule because there was no checks and balances, right? There was no Parliament called into session. And then in 1640, Charles I runs out of money. He's like, oh crap. Then he needs some money because there was a rebellion in Scotland that he wanted to put down. So then he calls Parliament back into session, and this is called Short Parliament. They didn't do what the king wanted them to do. So again, King Charles I is like, all right, I'm dismissing you again. And then King Charles I is going to call for new elections because he wants a new parliament that's going to listen to him more. This is nicknamed Long Parliament. And it's going to be done by a couple of things. The Triennial Act is Parliament trying to get more rights. And they're going to meet every 3 years. They're going to offer restrictions to the king. They're trying to have checks and balances on the power. But it just didn't work. It was this final piece of tension that actually starts the 30 Years' War because
starts the English Civil War.
Oh, thank you. English Civil War. Triennial Act didn't really do anything. It was Parliament's final attempt at getting some power and just got shut down completely by King Charles I.
Okay, so now let's do a little overview of the English Civil War. Basically, everybody in England, because the Civil War, has to support one side or the other. And here are our two sides. King Charles I is represented by the House of Lords, which is all the rich people in Parliament and his own army that he already has because he's the king, versus this new guy, this new individual we haven't introduced you to. His name is Oliver Cromwell. He is backed up by the House of Commons, which again is that middle class gentry in Parliament, which the rising middle class. This is mostly Puritans, and these are mostly people from North England. So Oliver Cromwell is going to be an important name to know. He's going to rise an army called the New Model Army. And so this is kind of the question of people who are deciding what side they should be on. Is England, should they be ruled by an absolute monarch, or should they exist as a constitutional monarchy? And essentially, after 3 years, we're not going to get into all the battles and stuff like that in AP Euro, but essentially after 3 years, Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army are victorious. They win. They beat King Charles I.
So then we're going to go through a play-by-play of events of what kind of happens. So after Oliver Cromwell and his New Model Army win, Charles I refuses to admit defeat. Right? He's a Puritan parliamentarian. Oliver Cromwell, that's what he is. He's going to actually just do one final battle, crush the king's remaining forces, and he actually captures the king himself. So Cromwell removes everyone that opposes him from Parliament, right? And he actually is going to say that anyone who's left is in support of him is nicknamed as Rump Parliament. This is a key term that College Board loves. Rump Parliament is the remaining Parliament that's in support of Cromwell and will do what he asks. But the Rump Parliament tries the king for treason. They find him guilty, and they actually behead the king.
Wait, I just want to say one thing I heard was that the vote was actually 68 to 67. It was one person, and then King Charles I gets beheaded, but his wife and daughter were allowed to run away.
And this was the first time a king was beheaded in England, so that's huge. So that marks the end of the English Civil War. What happens right afterwards is that England becomes a true republic. It's going to be called this thing called the Protectorate under the leadership of Cromwell. Cromwell is given the title of Lord Protector. And on paper, it sounds great, right? The Protectorate entrusted legislative authority to the remaining members of Parliament. Executive authority is going to be entrusted to a council, which is led by Oliver, so a little bit of checks and balances on paper. It's nicknamed a Commonwealth of England because it unifies the British Isles, which is Scotland, Ireland, and England, under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. All of that sounds great, except in reality, after the war, England is still ruled by the army that Oliver is leading. So it actually ends up being a military dictatorship for nearly a decade. So the reality does not match what was on paper for the Protectorate. And then Oliver Cromwell is going to try to work with Parliament a little bit, but again, he gets mad because Parliament isn't doing everything that he asked them to do. And then eventually he dismisses Parliament again. Then he's going to die. So the protectorate falls apart when Cromwell dies. People want a king again just because they're ready for some stability. They've been through kind of a whirlwind of this English Civil War. And this is going to start this restoration period where Parliament gives the throne to a guy named Charles II in 1660. This is a painting called Execution of Charles I by an unknown Dutch artist. It's really fascinating. You can see there's a lot of people in attendance. The head of Charles I on the right is right there being held up, beheading. It's a pretty good painting.
Now we're going to get into the Glorious Revolution, which takes place after the English Civil War. So the causes of the Glorious Revolution are basically some friction between the monarchy and parliament. So King Charles II, which is this new King Charles that had come in, does not work well with parliament, just like King Charles I and King James I. So after King Charles II comes King James II. He's the son of King Charles I and the brother of Charles II. Now King James II is Catholic. He wants freedom of worship for all these Catholics. He appoints Catholic officers to the army, and he's really tight with France, which a lot of this is going to worry the English people. And then in 1687, King James II is going to issue something called the Declaration of Indulgence, which basically helps out Catholics. It suspends all these laws that are put into place against the Catholics. And again, it dissolves Parliament to try to create a new Parliament that would support him unconditionally. 1 year later, in 1688, King James II has a son that he announces he's going to raise as a Catholic, which so now people are worried that, oh my gosh, is a Catholic going to be in charge of England one day? So this is a lot of fears that there's going to be a Catholic dynasty in England. And Parliament keeps getting dismissed and upset. And so all these parliamentary people are very upset and they're pretty angry at the monarchy after all this.
And remember, some context for this for the Glorious Revolution is the English Civil War, right? Without Charles II being given the throne, James II wouldn't have been given the throne, and then all of this wouldn't have happened. All right, so let's actually go over what the Glorious Revolution is and some short-term results. So the English called the events of 1688 to 1689 this so-called Glorious Revolution, or nicknamed Bloodless Revolution, because it replaces one king with another with hardly any bloodshed. Although, side note, it's not actually true because there were a lot of losses and death in Ireland and Scotland, but the English aren't really remembering that. So in November of 1688, the King, James II, remember Catholic King James, is going to be removed. Parliament offers the throne to his daughter, Mary, and her husband at the time, William of Orange. So hearing this, James II, remember the dad, actually runs away. He attempts to flee to England. He gets caught. He tries escaping again, where he safely makes it to France. You don't need to know that part, but it's just an interesting story that he just often books it, and then he eventually dies in exile in 1701. So then he is going to be replaced by his daughter, as we said, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. In 1689, they officially become the king and queen. So this transfer of power from the dad to the daughter is what's known as the Glorious Revolution.
Now we're going to get into the long-term effects of the Glorious Revolution and an important document called the English Bill of Rights. So the Glorious Revolution is the final destruction of the idea of a divine right monarchy, at least in England. Okay, so there's no more absolute power. Power is going to be checked by the kings because we get the creation of this document called the Bill of Rights in 1689, which is designed to limit royal power, and it's going to put a lot of checks on the king. It's going to grant Parliament control of all the finances, control of all the army. It's going to set forth a line of royal succession, which forbids anyone becoming king who is a Catholic. It states that English people have a certain amount of inalienable civil and political rights, like the freedom of speech and free elections, which you should remember is kind of, a little bit of context for America's own revolution. Okay. So this Bill of Rights is signed by both King William and Queen Mary, and it is the first step towards a constitutional monarchy. And so that's it.
If we are continuing our analogy, before we go back to analogy, there's a lot of names to know for this lesson. So here's a little bit of a timeline, kind of sort of monarchical family tree to help you kind of prioritize where people are in your head with pictures.
Right, so we got King James at the top, right? He was our first guy. We kind of talked about his son, Charles I, was kind of the main character in the English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell comes in. He rules for 10 years. Then they get rid of him, and Charles II comes in. So James II comes in. Charles II comes in, not very good. and then we have Mary and William of Orange.
So over there on the right is Glorious Revolution, the left is English Civil War. And the whole time you've been using the soccer analogy, right? We have two sides fighting over the soccer ball. We have on the left Parliament, and then we have on the right King Charles I and King James II, both of which are the two wars that we talked about, fighting over power of Britain, who's going to win. And eventually we know that Parliament actually wins through Mary and William of Orange. Here are College Board's historical developments. Thank you all for watching. Shout out to our AP Euro class. See you all for the next video on continuities and changes to economic practice and development.
Oh, that sounds fun.
So fun.
Until then, bye.